Oh, the snakes call it night. That's what they say when the sun goes down. Then the snake will play.
Okay, this guy's name is Nick Mero, and he married my aunt. He married my Aunt Kathy, and she is my mom's sister. So Nick Mero and my aunt had a son together. They had one child, and I think he was born in the mid-90s, and his name is Nick. And I remember bits and pieces of stories that different family members told me about Nick. Since they lived in California and I lived in New York and Connecticut, I did not get to know my cousins too well. I would only visit California during the summers, more when I was younger. And when I reached my 20s, I moved out with my girlfriend, and I did not go out to California as much. So what I remember hearing about my cousin Nick was that he was a very intelligent kid, but he was a little strange. And different family members said that it may have been because he was an only child. He had no siblings, so he was always around adults, meaning his mother and father. And he didn't play too much with other kids. And people in my family said that Nick was, of course, the central point to that family, and a lot of attention was directed at Nick. And Nick acted very mature when you spoke to him. At times it was like talking to a little adult, but he was also odd. And when I asked odd how, different people told me stories about him. And one of the stories was that he was dropped off with my grandmother one day so she could watch him. And I guess he did not like being separated from his mom or his dad. And he began to cry a little bit. So my grandmother wanted to distract him. And so she pointed up at the ceiling fan. And she started saying, "Isn't that a cool fan up there?" And she tried to introduce a conversation about the fan. So she was pointing up at the fan, and my family member said that he began to stare at the fan, and he was very interested in the ceiling fan. And from that point forward, his new thing as a 6, 7, 8-year-old kid was to carry around fans. So he loved fans from then on. I guess his mom or dad bought him the little fans that you plug in and you put on your desk. And he would carry those around wherever he went as a comfort thing. So when I met him, he must have been, I would say, maybe 8 or 9 years old. He wasn't much older than 10. And I remember that my aunt brought him to my grandmother's house. And when he walked in, he did not look at me. He did not like to make eye contact. He kind of stared forward, but he did not look directly at anyone. And I said something like, "How old are you now?" And he says, 10. And I said, "What grade are you in?" And instead of being polite, knowing that I was just trying to start a conversation with him, he answered the question in a slightly rude tone. And he said, "Well, since I just told you I was 10, then you should know that most 10-year-olds are in the 5th grade." And how he answered that was like a obnoxious old person would answer you very rude. I used to be an emergency medical technician, and I had to deal with a lot of elderly people. And when they get old, they get rude. Oftentimes they are depressed. They do not like being ill. Maybe they start developing Alzheimer's or dementia, and this kind of frustrates them or makes them a little bit angry, and they really don't want to talk too much. So they kind of set the precedent that they're going to be rude, so it's best just to limit the conversation. So I noticed that he was responding like an old person that was just trying to be rude to shut me up. So that was the first contact I had with him. So what this suggests is somebody with something like autism or antisocial personality disorder. So that is how different family members would describe him too. That he is very smart and mature for such a young kid. He must have a high IQ. He talks like he's a little adult. But the truth was that the kid was emotionally and socially stunted. So here is a photograph of Nick when he was around that age when I first met him and spoke to him. And I would say he was around 10 years old. And he had this same type of expression on his face. And to be honest with you, it kind of looks robotic. The expression kind of looks staged. He is just staring blankly with this unusual smile on his face. He looks almost like a little robot. So some other things that I heard from different family members was that my aunt was very protective of him, and she did not like him to have a social life. For some reason, she felt that Nick had to be protected, so he really didn't have too many friends when he was younger. And I was told by different family members that my aunt was so protective that if they went to a restaurant when Nick was around 10 or 12 years old, she would not let him go to the restroom by himself. She had to accompany him to the restroom and then bring him into the female restroom so that she could make sure he was okay when going to a public restroom. She was too nervous or scared for some reason. Something made her paranoid and overprotective about her son, that she wouldn't even let him go to the bathroom, a public restroom, by himself. I could see walking your kid to the restroom and then waiting outside for them, but that is pretty extreme. So what this suggests to me is that due to Nick's behavior and the way he acted, my aunt was nervous that there may have been a problem somewhere, and she wanted to protect him from being abused. So when he was younger, I was told by different people is that he never went out with friends from school. He never went to a school dance. He never had a girlfriend. He only had school and home life. He never had a social life. So when Nick graduated high school and it was time for him to go to college, I heard from different family members that my aunt and uncle, Nick's parents, had made up their minds for some reason to move to wherever he was accepted to school. And he was interested in going to a school in Vermont, right near where I lived in New Hampshire. And they were also looking at schools in Utah. So when Nick decided to go to school in Utah, his mother and father moved to Utah and they bought a house in Utah so Nick could live at home and then commute back and forth to school. So I think that is a little excessive, that you can't even let your son go to college by himself. And a side note is that if this was the case, if Nick had maybe a personality problem, maybe he was diagnosed with a mental illness or a psychiatric issue, maybe they should have found a college around the area of California where they lived, the city college or a community college. And that way maybe Nick could get used to going to college for a couple of years and get an associate's degree, and then maybe consider going off to college on his own later on. So it's very odd that if Nick had a emotional or a mental issue that inhibited his ability to go off on his own to college, it's a little strange that his parents would then say, well, go ahead and apply all over the country, and wherever you get accepted, we're going to move out there with you and buy a house in the area. So different people in my family commented that it was a little unusual for Kathy and Eric to do that. So Utah is a huge Mormon state. The Mormons' home state is Utah, which is a very rural state controlled by the Mormon religion. The Mormons are very prevalent in that state. They are very influential in that state. There is a huge majority of Mormons that live in that state. I think most of the people that live in Utah are Mormon. And if you trace the origin of the Mormon religion, you're going to find some unusual facts about that religion. So Eric Mero never told anybody what his religion was growing up. He never said anything about his religion, and he acted like he wasn't very religious. And my aunt was raised up in a Catholic family, and they were not strict Catholics, but they would go to Mass at times, maybe on different holidays. But I do not remember anyone being too religious in my family. So I would not be surprised to find out that Eric Mero have been a Mormon at some point in his life, because the whole story about how they wound up in Utah just seems odd. So I would like to now tell you a little bit about the Mormon religion.
Oh,